Thank you, Jakob. And yes, I will try to make it short and as crisp as possible. I fear I will have to go back and to the kind of standardization discussions that we had yesterday, back from the global and important decisions, but reflecting it back down in terms of carbon footprinting and in a certain way also environmental footprinting. And what I would like to do is mostly address how really the current standards that we're mostly talking about, what do they actually say about accounting for supplier-specific electricity and also in that sense for green power. And would like to give you some of my observations and conclusions, perhaps recommendations also, what this could lead us to. And I would like to start with a slide which is taken from the IPCC report on a special report on renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation, recently published, like 1 or 2 years ago. And it's actually something that you are all familiar with in greenhouse gas accounting, a comparison of the life cycle emissions of a kilowatt hour produced of different energy sources. And no surprise, you find coal to the far right with a lot of life cycle emissions, oil, natural gas, nuclear energy, wind, and so on. These are the full life cycle emissions, so not just the direct emissions, but also indirect emissions, and like a summary of a lot of different studies. And I'm sure in calculations that you do, in some sense, when you have a specific electricity source or a specific source of electricity, then you would use emission factors in that sense. What this slide tells us definitely is the relation between fossil fuels and renewable energy in general, so that we see, okay, well, renewable energy, if these figures hold true, which I do think they do, then this is really a lower carbon or almost zero carbon emission sources in some sense. So the question is, why are we talking about the challenges of accounting for green power? There we have, of course, a lot of different, let's say, discussions currently where this is coming up. We, of course, hear again and again, and or see the market in a way saying, okay, well, we use green power as a measure for achieving corporate climate targets. Okay, after hearing the keynote speech and also earlier yesterday what we heard, well, taking or using renewable energy is a measure for mitigating climate change. So it seems reasonable. If I use green power, then I make a contribution to climate change mitigation or to my climate change targets. The same for product carbon footprints. If I use green power, am I able to reduce the carbon footprints of my products? Question mark, exclamation mark, question mark. Same as a lot of, at least in Germany, we have that. There are green power. You can buy green power. It's a liberalized market, and there are labels on the market, so you can buy green power as a consumer. And a lot of organizations argue as well, buy green power as a contribution to climate change mitigation. It helps. Even the government is making that claim in a sense. And then we have this big discussion around e-mobility, which is of course a big user of electricity possibly in the future. And we are already now talking, well, these need to be fueled by green, clean electricity, green power, because one reason we are heavily engaging in e-mobility is because of climate change. And you may have heard like a recent campaign by Greenpeace addressing like some of the probably most known companies at the moment, or like most discussed, kind of asking for cleaning up their operations in terms of the electricity consumption that they have for providing cloud services and other data intensive services, and specifically addressing the coal consumption that is behind that. and of course also putting that in the context of climate change. So the question is, again, well, are all of these claims wrong, or how can they may be made right or more right than currently is? And when I talk about how the standards actually look at that at the moment, of course, it's important to say, okay, what are we really talking about? We're not talking about on-site generation. For those companies or others that really produce electricity themselves, directly use that, have fully financed it themselves and so on, then of course you can use the emission factors that life cycle emission factors of that energy source. So the other thing is the grid-based scenario. So electricity that I get from the grid, in the best sense of the word, the power or green power that I may purchase through the grid. So that the whole challenge in accounting for green power is in that part of the picture. So electricity that I get from the grid, what can I really say in terms of the contribution to greenhouse gas reductions or climate change mitigation that makes? And I'll quickly run through the standards. I don't want to do it too thoroughly, mostly of time, and also because they're very similar in a sense. So starting with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard, it says emission factors that you get from the electricity that you purchase should be geographically specific, and if you can get a supplier-specific emission factor, then this can be used if these emissions are then excluded from the regional emission factors, and others then make use of that. The ISO standard, the current draft, at least, so we have to be careful, there's still maybe modifications in it. It says, okay, well, you can use a supplier-specific emission factor for the power that you purchase if you ensure that it is not double counted. And they explain what they mean by that. If you cannot ensure that it is double counted, then you use the national grid mix factor, which is like the average factor for the electricity grid. So to ensure that double counting doesn't take place, you have to ensure that another process did not claim the generator-specific emission factors, and more importantly perhaps, that the electricity production does not influence the emission factors of any other process or organization. So there's a demand that in your calculations you kind of have to also take responsibility for how others are really accounting for renewable energy in their own calculations, which is a very difficult thing to do. So really demonstrating that double counting doesn't take place is kind of a hard issue here. So the default option is to use the average grid mix emission factor. And they're also making a reference to green certificates, when they are not really coupled to electricity, like renewable energy certificates and others, like this bigger discussion, okay, what kind of green power attributes can you buy? Then there's also a risk of double counting if it's not a proper system. So that's just a side remark there. Past 2050, just quickly mentioned, it's very similar to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The default option is to really use the average electricity supply emission factor for the country in which the electricity is used. And for renewable energy specific emission factors, it has the same provisions that we had previously. Another process did not use the energy and also claiming it as renewable. And the renewable energy does not influence the emission factors of other processes organizations. And additionally, it is excluded from the national average emission factor that everybody uses as the default factor. And of course, this is again difficult to really demonstrate. So the really default option is to say you have to use the average emission factor that you use in your carbon inventory. What most people, most experts and those undertaking carbon footprint assessments would then also do. They have a bit of a side note that say in some countries where this electricity flow, especially the renewable electricity flow, is properly accounted for, then there's an option to actually use like the more specific emission factors, because I can more easily ensure that others then take really a residual mix emission factor in account. And just quickly mentioning the current discussions, as I understand, and we yesterday heard also from Rana Pant that this is still like refined, but in the to ensure comparability in the EU environmental footprinting methodology, in last draft there was a decision for also using a country-specific mixed data emission factor as the. It's not true anymore. Can we have a mic? Okay, you can address it in a second, yeah. Okay, so I'm looking forward to that. So this challenge is not new. We've also had that in the PCF pilot project in Germany, for example, and came to the conclusion there that it is, of course, important to really look at electricity when we talk about climate protection. So there is really a need to somehow make sense and use supplier-specific relationships in future methodologies. And I think we're still in the middle of this discussion, but so far this is still not really the case. There we recommended and also treated it in the way that we included additional scenarios where like green power emission factors or lower emission factors for specific supply relationships were taken into account as an additional information to the default carbon footprint. And also we looked at green power more specifically, and there is of course also a discussion going on what is the benefit of green power, or when can we really claim something to be green power. And there is a lot of demand or interest to say, okay, well, we really have to look closer what we call green power in terms also of the age that certain installations have. Very old green power, also the question who has financed that, may actually be more part of the grid system than really helping to mitigate climate change. So there was also a proposal to really use newer, recently installed green power really as green power, or like as lower emission electricity, and older ones as rather grid emission electricity. So these are just some hints on where that is, and to kind of sum it up and also add some other further perspectives to the discussion, there's some challenges. So there was frequent reference to the residual mix, that if there's a residual mix available, and you can ensure that it's calculated, and you can ensure that it's used, then it's all possible. So currently residual mix calculations, they take place sometimes in some countries, but they are not widely available in that sense, and definitely not institutionalized that in a way that, okay, well, here we have an authority that really says, okay, this is the residual mix that needs to be taken by everyone. I'm looking forward to the presentations that follow, because I think we'll understand some more what is happening there, perhaps. Then, perhaps more important, it is currently not prescribed, and perhaps difficult to prescribe in the standards, that the residual mix must be taken as the default option. Currently, the default option is you need the standard electricity mix, grid mix emission factor. But to really make sure that nobody else claims a certain green power in the grid, you would actually have to have as the default option that the residual mix is taken into account by default in all calculations. But this is something that is not prescribed yet, but I think something to look at. Then we have also this discussion, and this is kind of leaving a bit the specific carbon footprint standards, but are important in that context, that we have a lot of different mechanisms for renewable energy uptake. So why is renewable energy actually installed around the world. Of course, we have regulatory regimes, we have subsidies, feed-in tariffs, we may have cap and trade systems or climate change targets, renewable targets, and different instruments that are implemented to increase uptake of renewable energy in the grid system. And the other question, of course, is who has paid for actually a renewable energy increase in the grid? And kind of the question, okay, well, the one who has paid for it probably can also get the benefit of the reduced emission that you have with that. So the question is, if you use green power, have you fully paid for that, or was it somebody else? Or if you use it, how does it actually, or how is it actually reflected in national targets? If you use green power, maybe somebody else can use less power or so, less green power, because there's more flexibility in the system. And also green power means very different things. I mean, I also use the general term, but we have different green power labels. There are requirements on additionality, like is it new power plants or old power plants? Do we look at specific financial transactions when I buy certain green power in the market? Like, am I still buying like classic electricity from the grid, which may be a lot of coal also, and still my money flows go to that, and I buy like an additional attribute of green power? Then of course the question is, okay, well, do I actually change anything in the system? And some of the green power definitions and labels obviously take a closer look and say, well, green power can only be named green power where we really have a clear transaction and funding of renewable energy sources. And what last sentence should have read is the question of international trade. That it also seems to be important. I'm really curious about the next presentation, 2 after mine. But for example, as I understood in the past, we know that there's a lot of power, at least in Germany, but also in Europe, like renewable energy certificates bought from Norway, in a sense. So what happens in Norway with the electricity mix? And my understanding was so far that this is then declared as unknown electricity from unknown sources. It's kind of this part here. I found that as a statement, I think from one of the offices there reporting on the electricity mix in Norway. And this unknown source electricity is then taken into account, because we don't know what it is, with 0 emissions. So we buy it in Germany, like the green power attribute, and then in Norway there remains unknown power with 0 emissions, which is kind of a nice thing, because then we all have the benefit. Maybe we don't know if it's wind anymore, but it's at least a 0 carbon emission source. But I think there's something about it to happen. I learned yesterday at dinner, actually, so I'm happy to understand that better also. But this is, of course, an issue where a lot of people really criticize the current system and say, okay, well, if we talk about green power, this doesn't work if we don't ensure that then a proper accounting system is really in place to ensure that this doesn't happen. So quickly, of course, what would be arguments for really using supplier-specific emission factors and green power emission factors? We kind of have the question, what role does the private market play in stimulating climate change mitigation measures? And we know renewable energy is one of the more important climate mitigation measures. So what is the role of the private market? If it has a role, then it somehow needs to be accounted for. Also, accounting for supply-specific electricity is rather straightforward. We have a lot of that information in many countries, so it's published. Maybe it needs to be enriched, because a lot of times it's direct emissions. You may have to take into account full life cycle emissions, but which is possible. All that information is generally available. So it's not so difficult and doesn't require such a totally new framework. Also, green power is a widely accepted measure for climate change mitigation. A lot of people say, okay, well, if I use green power, then I contribute to climate change. If I cannot say that anymore, it makes it more difficult. And I would kind of say a little bit provocative, is double counting really a problem? I mean, we have other double counting decisions that we take in life cycle assessments, like on allocation or recycling and so on, where I have to take a decision for my product system and don't fully take into account all the double counting that may take place, like with a co-product or so in other product systems, because that's still an individual decision, and there we also don't see it as much of a problem. So, last slide. What would I take from what I just presented? I think the probably most straightforward pathway for the whole carbon footprint business is to somehow require the use of a residual mix in all calculations and define perhaps a bit more, okay, what does this really mean, so that we really have a good balance of the green power that was traded and used. For those that practically work with assessments already, for example, in scenarios, in addition to the default option, I see with all the provisions that we have, these should aim where they use default factors. They're to use a residual mix factor where it is available, because it is published in some frameworks. Be careful about feed-in tariffs, other subsidies that have been used for our own green power production, because I may install photovoltaics on my own plants, but actually use feed-in, like sell them to the grid and get feed-in subsidies from like the state that I'm operating in. So who can make that claim? Be a bit careful about that. Be also careful about including old renewable energy. Just because there is an issue there. I also had that nice example yesterday. I mean, all the hydropower capacity in Norway that is now bought from Europe, it was originally built with a lot of taxpayers' money from Norwegian people that actually paid for the original installations. And so isn't it up to them to claim also the benefits that may have? I mean, this is like an example of old renewable energy that we are now kind of claiming as renewable energy. If you use green power, ensure robust tracking and certification because of the issues of trading, double counting, and also perhaps additional criteria that you may want to account for when using green power. And last but not least, it's just to mention, many do it, of course, but not always done, use full life cycle emission factors for also renewable energy, because even there you of course have indirect emissions, or also renewable power plants need to be built some sense. So to not take this into account would be probably not a good way forward. So this is some thinking around how I observe it. I'm very open to hear corrections, additions, further thinking, and I think the next 3 presentations will also put this in a different perspective from their respective view. So, thank you.